My name is Bill Lubick. I'm with the Rutgers Cooperative Extension here in Middlesex County, and I'm here with Angela Monahan and Pat Donahue and Dave Smella, and we're here for the Are You Ready to Garden series. And before we get started, I just want to thank all of our sponsors that enable us to be able to be here tonight and each Thursday night to present programs. I want to thank the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station because that's really where all of our information that based on research emanates from the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station and the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, working together with other land-grant universities throughout the region and throughout the country. And I want to especially thank our county commissioners, our county government, because without them, we wouldn't have our offices and our wonderful staff within each county to be able to do all of the programming that we do, such as the Master Gardener program. And as a result of the many Master Gardeners we teach, one of our Master Gardeners, Pat Donahue, is going to be here tonight to talk about drying herbs and flowers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela. She's going to give a little bit more of a special introduction to Pat Donahue before she gets into talking about drying herbs and flowers. We had a lot of interest in this program tonight, so I know there's a lot of people out there looking forward to this and very excited about it.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Hi, my name's Angela Monahan. I am the coordinator, the Master Gardener coordinator for Middlesex County. And just a quick bio of what Master Gardeners do. So Master Gardeners are trained volunteers, and they help Rutgers Cooperative Extension in their outreach efforts on horticulture and teaching the public about environmentally sound horticulture, to be specific. And so our program here in Middlesex, when it does run, we have our indoor classroom time where we have a lecture series from extension agents from all over the state come and talk about their specialty ideas on various horticultural topics. And then we go out in the garden and do our hands-on portion. So Master Gardeners are usually well-rounded in lots of different topics. But anyway, Pat Donahue is a past science teacher. She's retired now, but this lends really well for being a Master Gardener for Pat. She is going to have a great presentation tonight. So without further ado.
Yes, hi, I'm Pat. A little about myself. I have a bachelor's in environmental protection from Columbia University, and I got my master's at Rutgers in environmental geography. And then I went into teaching, and I taught public school for a long time. So as a lifelong learner, as soon as I retired, I felt I needed to learn something else, so I became a Master Gardener. And I've been doing some presentations, and I hope you'll enjoy this one with me tonight. So we're going to start by talking about herbs for the first half and then flowers for the second half. So what's an herb? And if you go to Master Gardener School, you'll learn that there are a lot of definitions, and the word herb actually has a very precise scientific definition. You see it there. But most of us think of herbs as some type of plant or flower or seed that we can use in our food, in medicine, or to make perfume or something that smells nice. There are lots of different kinds of herbs, many of them very useful. Some you use fresh, some you have to prepare before you can use them, but at the end of the season they all stop growing, even if you try and bring them indoors. So it's nice to save them by drying them, and then you can use them all year round. So there are several advantages of having your own. Obviously, it's much less expensive. You're not buying them. If you grow them organically, you know that they don't have any chemicals or have been irradiated. Sometimes the store-bought ones have been treated. They typically have a higher nutrient and vitamin content in them, and you usually require less than fresh. It's usually about a ratio of 1 to 3. And you can keep them in your house for up to a year, and they'll still have their potency. There are basic steps. Pick them early. Wash them, dry them, and store them. And I'm going to address each one of these points. Okay. So the modern way of drying things, you might consider an electric food dehydrator. I just picked this picture because I liked it, but I have found them ranging from $100 to some very professional ones for $1,800. And I felt that I just really want to keep it simple, and especially to keep it very inexpensive. So what I'm going to show you, really you can use some things that you already have around the house. Okay? Let's make a distinction before we get started about two basic types of herbs. You're going to have ones that have a high moisture content. They have a lot of water in them: basil, chives, lemon balm, and mint. Now, I personally have not had any trouble air drying these. However, it can be more difficult than some of the others. And so there's a recommended method here that simply uses your oven and a cookie sheet. I have never done this method. I've never found it necessary. But if you do encounter a problem just air drying them, remember that you can go back and put them in a very, very low setting in your oven for 1 or 2 hours. However, they're not going to come out as nice as if you were just simply air drying them in the house. You may want to consider freezing them instead, but there are some disadvantages and advantages to that as well. So let's start with the old-fashioned way. And the old-fashioned way was to dry the herbs, hanging them upside down. But there's a problem with this, and that is that as they dry, some of the herbs fall. And when you go to handle them and move them around, oftentimes a lot of the material will fall. So this is where I came up with my little method to avoid losing what I had worked so hard to grow. And I like to include this slide of my first #1 tip about herbs is to please label your plants. Now, I can usually tell them apart. A beginner gardener, maybe not so much, but certainly when I send my husband out to go pick something, if it's not labeled, he's not going to find it. So I make sure that all of my herbs are labeled. And then you will also consider what plant are you looking at. If you're looking, for example, at a rosemary, this is a perennial, and it might stay green all winter. Maybe you don't even need to dry some, unless, of course, you'd rather have it in the house and not have to go out in the cold and the snow to go get it. Basil, on the other hand, is an annual that fades very quickly, especially in our very hot summers. And so you typically want to pick it early. So do you do it now or later? Consider what you can leave for a little later, so you're not trying to dry all of your herbs at the same time. You can leave the sage, the parsley, the rosemary, and the thyme well into the fall. But the others you should be working on sooner rather than later, usually when they're looking their best. So to start with the lower moisture contact, you see a list of them there. And I just said that thyme and rosemary and sage you could probably leave for a bit later in the season. But the others are very easy to air dry and to get started on right away. Try to pick them before they get overgrown and before they start flowering. It's best to harvest them in the morning when the dew has evaporated, but before the sun is drying out and stressing the plant. Remove any dirt that you find, shake them gently to get the dust off, and you can even swirl them in some cool water in the sink. You can pat them dry very gently, or just leave them to air dry on a cooling rack. If you see any unsightly leaves, anything that is torn or spotted, you can remove those at this point. And while they're drying off, you can collect your supplies. And this is as simple and inexpensive a method as you can find. You will need a pair of scissors, a marker, some twine or string, and paper bags. I'm using the old-fashioned paper bags that folks used to pack their lunch in to go to school or to go to work. And with these 4 items, you are all set. The first thing to do is label your bag. You can label it wherever you want. I happen to label mine on the bottom. And then make sure that you're using the labeled plant from outside as the same herb that's going into this bag. I once had a little confusion there and ended up with a mixture. I didn't know what was in it, and I used it anyway. But now I'm much more careful. And what you want to do is cut some openings along both sides of the bag and snip one opening on each side in the middle of the bag. And this is the area where you're going to pass your twine through. Now this is thyme, and I've gathered it in a bunch, making sure that all the pieces are facing in the same direction, and I've tied them at the bottom. Now, some folks advocate that you snip off all of the leaves at the bottom and just tie the twiggy ends. I've tried it both ways, and I haven't found that it makes much of a difference. So you hang your bunch of herbs inside the bag. You pass the ends of the twine out through the middle slits, tie those ends together, and hang it up. Select a dry place that is out of the sun, but you really should have some good air circulation. And you're going to leave them there until the herbs are brittle. Now, I recommend a minimum of 2 weeks. I've actually hung some of these bags up and forgotten about them and realized a couple months later, oops, they're still hanging there, and everything has been fine. But the more dry they are, the better. So you open up your bag. You can use any kind of a bowl that you happen to have and shake out the bag. And this is where having it in a bag comes in handy because any pieces that have fallen you haven't lost in your house. They're all still in the bag. Now, when I first started doing this, I took everything apart. I removed the twine, I folded the bag, and then I said, why am I doing this? I just tuck the twine back into the bag, fold the bag shut, and then as you saw in an earlier slide where I had all of my bags laid out, I just put them away and I used them again the following year. So once you've done this, you're basically set up for several years to go. Now, I just use my fingers to remove the leaves from the twigs. This is dill, and it doesn't look like much, but I just had a little left. I wanted to make sure that I had some to show you. And I've got my pieces that I want to save in the bowl, and the other small pieces I'm going to put in a little stainless steel container that I keep in my kitchen, and this is where I put all my food scraps. I call it my little composter, but I don't compost in it. And when this container is full, I take it outside, and we have a tumbler-type composter. And this year I was very excited because I used all of my compost to grow all my herbs. I mixed it with soil in my pot, and I got a really, really nice crop this year. So I highly recommend collecting all these bits and pieces from your kitchen. Jars. You're going to store them, your herbs. You should use airtight containers. And canning jars are very recommended, as are zippered plastic bags. I do not like the zippered plastic bags. They're too difficult to manage. And quite frankly, I really don't like these airtight containers, not the ones that I'm showing you in the picture. I bought them because I thought they were going to be very user-friendly, and they were not. I had a hard time labeling them. I eventually had to take out my little P-Touch printer and print labels for them. They take up too much space. They don't stack nicely. So I'm going to be experimenting with some better storage methods for them. Try not to crush anything unless you've got too much that won't fit in the container. Leave the leaves as fluffy as you can. And you may want to label and date your container in case they get too old. They're not really going to be as flavorful, so you may want to replace them. And store them in a cool, dry place out of the sun. So I decided that I'm going to start saving some of the store-bought containers for spices that I have. And I also discovered that you can buy them. So the one on the right with the red top is a generic container that I happen to find. And I like it because it also has the little holes for the shaker. Or you can unscrew the entire top. Because it's cylindrical, it's easier to store them one next to the other. They don't take up as much space. So experiment with containers, but I believe I'm going to prefer these once I'm done experimenting. Now there is one more supply that is optional. Consider having a mortar and pestle to grind your herbs, but wait until you're ready to use them. That is going to release the flavors and the fragrances, and you can crush them and then put them right into whatever you are cooking or making. But again, you don't have to. And if you wanted to crush your herbs and you don't have a mortar and pestle, you could do something as simple as use the back of a spoon inside a small bowl, and that would have the same effect. So that's it on herbs. And I'm going to move on to flowers unless someone tells me.
One of the questions Armando asked, how long until the oils from the dry herbs, just moved. How long until the oils from the dry herbs start to evaporate after dried in open air and lose significant potency?
The rule of thumb is that you can keep herbs for up to a year, but that's in a closed container. 6 months is kind of your inside limit. So depending on how much you love that herb and how much you feel that you need to use, because the older the herb is, the more of it you have to use. But 6 months to 1 year is kind of the standard.
Okay. Also, how much do you cut off of your herb plants from your garden? Do you cut them all the way down?
No. If you're harvesting herbs and it's a bit earlier in the season, you want to leave enough for the plant to keep growing. With the basil, I like to keep cutting it when it's starting to get that look at the top like it wants to make a flower, as I don't want to let it flower. I don't think I ever take off more than 1/4 to 1/3 of a plant at any one time. Sometimes I decided that I'm done, I'm going to dry everything, and I do chop the plant down. But usually I only do that if I have a second of that same type plant. For example, I have, I think now 3 or 4 types of thyme. So I might do one. But typically, some plants you can cut back more than others, and they'll come right back. You'd have to look into that a little bit more.
And lastly, Barbara was asking, in reference to one of your slides, do you pick them early in the day or season? What did you mean?
You pick them early in the day, after the dew has evaporated, but before the sun has gotten to them. And you should also pick them, for example, rosemary. My rosemary bush still looks fantastic, so I haven't picked it. But something like basil, you might be picking that earlier in the season because you want to pick it when it's vibrant and dry it then. If you wait too long, it gets leggy. But in general, you always pick your herbs when you're actually removing them in the morning.
Pat, I'm sorry, did you just hear me?
Oh, I'm hearing you now.
Oh, okay. Your buddy Esther is asking, how can you prevent the herbs from browning?
Browning when they're growing or browning when they're browning when they're drying? I have no idea. I put them in the bags and I hang them, and if they change color, I know that the ones you buy in the store are typically quite green. So, for example, I bought cilantro in the store, and it was bright, bright green, but I dried my own, and it was almost like a palish green-brown. I think that happens because the store-bought ones are treated. And so, no, I don't have an answer to that. If you can, at home, keep them from browning. It's something I'll look into, Esther.
And last, Karen Kennedy is asking, how do you dry parsley and basil, specifically?
The same way. Those are 2 high moisture content herbs, and so you want to make sure that they're drying quickly. Otherwise, you're going to have to use that oven method. which I have not had to do. Do it the same way. I would be careful, especially with the basil, not to pack it in too tightly into the paper bag. I typically make smaller bundles, so I just showed you one of each bag, but I probably have 4 to 6 that are labeled basil and 4 to 6 that are labeled something else. If you bunch them in together too much, then they don't have enough air circulation to dry.
Great. That's all we have. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to flowers. Okay, drying flowers. So there's a couple of methods here. Of course, the laziest way is to just simply leave them in their bouquet if you're trying to dry the flowers in a bouquet. There's a very fast way using the microwave, which I have not done, but I am going to at least show you. And again, the old-fashioned way by hanging them upside down. So here are examples of the lazy way. These folks had these are not mine, these folks had these beautiful bouquets, and they simply left them someplace where it was cool and dry with plenty of air circulation, and they just dried naturally and were left that way. So that's the lazy way. Now there's the microwave method, and I have never done this, and I don't know that I would. Okay, apparently if you microwave it in 30-second intervals and you keep checking on it, and then you leave the flour completely buried in the sand for 24 hours, it comes out, and there's your before and after picture. Now, this only works well for whole or larger flowers. I tend to gather just about every kind of flower I can find. And in looking at this method and looking at what you can gather in your garden, I decided that this, to me, was not worth trying with small flowers. There's another similar method that uses a silica gel that's similar to this method, but I've never tried that one either. And again, let's do this in an inexpensive way with whatever you happen to have hanging around at home. So the old-fashioned way, again, is simply to hang them. I like the pictures on the left. I don't know if you can see it, but the hangers are actually on nails. And these are being used decoratively instead of putting a picture up on the wall. And the pictures on the right, this person has really gotten a lot of flowers and gathered them together. If you have big bunches of particular kinds of flowers, then this could work for you. I tend more to have a little bit of everything. So I do it a slightly different way. And keep in mind that same comment that I made for herbs, that when the flowers are hanging this way, bits and pieces can fall off, and when you disturb them or try to move them, that they're likely to start to break apart. So my method, you need some simple things: a cookie sheet, some paper towels, a large plastic container with a lid, and these desiccant packs. Now, when I first started this, I was thinking to myself, where in the world am I going to find these desiccant packs? And I now have 2 zip bags full. I've been finding them everywhere. You find them in leather goods if you buy a pair of shoes. They come inside medicine and vitamin bottles. I just ordered a table that I assembled myself, and sure enough, there were desiccant packs inside the packaging material. The pool store has them. My friends collect them for me. So I haven't yet to pay for them or to buy them, but I'm sure that you could order them online just like any other supply. But I have managed to get quite a collection just from keeping my eyes open for where they are used and taking them. One note, don't ever use one that has come with food. So, for example, my dog's treats have a desiccant pack in it, but now it's been exposed to a food that's not completely dry, and it has absorbed some other smells and things other than just water. So please don't ever take one that's been in a food container. So what I do is I take my cookie sheet and I lay paper towels down at the bottom, and then I spread the flowers that I've picked in my yard and I spread them out, trying to give each flower a bit of its own space. And then I leave them in the open air. I had a couple of cookie sheets laying on my dining room table for a couple of weeks. And I will, from time to time, I'll go over and I will turn the larger flowers over or flip them from one side to another, just to make sure that every side of it dries and that it's not in any way sticking. I haven't had that happen yet. Most of them you don't have to turn, but the larger flowers I like to make sure that I do turn them. And I've experimented with some other containers, and this is one of my favorite containers. This is from, I don't know if I'm supposed to name a particular company, but there's a place you can go and you can buy these large muffins, and they come 6 to a pack. And the containers open up perfectly flat, and then you have 2 sides. You can cut them apart if you want, but then you have 2 sides that you can work with the flowers. Now, I had one of these containers, and I put flowers in it, and I didn't realize that it didn't lay perfectly flat, and one side kept trying to slip up and spilled all my flowers. So if you're going to use a plastic container, you should lay it down and make sure it's actually going to stay down. It's not going to pop back up at you. So when the flowers are dry, I put them in a large plastic container, and I sprinkle in some desiccant packs, and then I cover the container. As you keep adding more and more flowers, you have to add more desiccant packs. If someone has a question, says, how many do you use per how many flowers? I don't know. I just scatter them in there, and I haven't had a problem yet. Certainly, if you have a large container, you probably want at least a dozen, but I haven't really taken a look at that. Now, roses are a little bit different. I don't grow roses myself, but I wanted to have rose petals, and the way to do it is to remove the petals from the flowers first, and then dry them and store them the exact same way. I think it's easier to remove the petals when you've picked the flower or it's starting to droop, rather than dry the flower and then try and pull it apart. I don't think that would work very well. And one thing to keep in mind is that your houseplants also flower. These are from a tiny orchid that I have. And I didn't realize at first that my spider plant was flowering, my amaryllis. There are a number of flowers that you keep inside, and you can dry those flowers the exact same way. I really like to experiment with textures and colors, and I've been playing around with adding different items of interest. I have a tree that produces these very tiny pine cones. I've collected seed pods and the little fronds from the ends of grasses. What else do I have here? I have fern fronds, and some of these I put in holes, some of them I break apart into smaller pieces, and little tiny acorns. And it's fun because as you go through your flowers to use them for something, not only are you saying, oh, I recognize this flower, this was a daffodil, you start seeing some of these bits and pieces, and I think that they add interest. So here's my container that I filled with flowers, and I keep it in the dark, in a dry area, and until I'm ready to do something with them. And so far, I've done 2 things with them, and I have an idea for a third. So my garden club was having a booth at a fair, and we decided that we were going to take all of the dried flowers and we were going to make sachets. So we bought these little sachet bags and had a little booth set up, and people came and were able to select and scoop their own flowers and fill the sachets and added an essential oil. Now, the collection of flowers will have an odor, but it's not an odor of any particular thing. So we had a selection of essential oils. And there's one exception to this. I'll get to that in a minute. I think this class, if any of you are from the recent class, you did not get to have the horticultural therapy lesson. This is where I learned about the sachets, that having seniors and the disabled and troubled kids do this is beneficial. We found that the audience for these was actually quite wide. We had little boys coming and buying them and saying, oh, my mother's going to love this. I'm going to put it in my soccer sports bag so it doesn't smell so bad, which I thought was cute. And you can do this with herbs as well. You can make sachets of a particularly favorite herb, if you happen to love the smell of rosemary, for example. The only exception to this is lavender. Because lavender has its own odor, you don't need to add an essential oil to it. And when the odor of the lavender seems as if it's fading, all you need to do is crush it a little with your fingers, and that lovely aroma will come back. I've also tried working with some larger objects. So the one on the left does not include flowers, but it does have a cinnamon stick and a poppy seed pod that I brought home from Ukraine, a big pine cone, and then the one on the right has some larger flowers that I found or dried myself. I'm not very good at floral arranging, so I'm practicing, but I do have an idea that I want to try with, if I can go back for just a second. Go back to here. When you see all of these flowers, and depending on what you've mixed in, you can decide for yourself if you want to put a certain color scheme together or certain sizes together. And what I would like to do is to take a vase, particularly one that is very skinny, or even two panes of glass in some sort of a stand. And I would love to pour the flowers in so that you could see them from all angles all the way around. I think that would be very, very pretty. So that is my next plan, is to find a suitable container and try that. So I have a couple of trivia questions here. And see, this is supposed to click and you don't get the answer. And you're supposed to guess, but so now nobody's guessing. So the color flower that's the most difficult to work with is white. I was very disappointed to discover that my white azaleas, the flowers just turned completely brown. There are few flowers I found that started out white and stayed white. That one was a toughie. The flower that dries the absolute best is the hyacinth. This surprised me. I was really very, very impressed. They held their shape, they held their color, they didn't break apart. So I was excited about doing that again next year, because I just experimented with that this year. So since we're talking about flowers, we will end. Roses will stay red and violets will stay blue. Experiment with flowers and see what happens to you. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
That was great, Pat. Thank you so much. I do have a couple questions.
Sure.
Katie was asking, how long do the desiccant packs last?
You know, that's an excellent question, because I've been using them. I've been doing this about a year and a half. And once the flowers are really, really dry, the desiccant packs there are in there really just for safety's sake. They're not actually drying the flowers. The flowers are already dry. They're just making sure that if any moisture gets into the container, the desiccant pack gets it, and it doesn't affect the flowers that are in the container. So I'm guessing that they can last a very long time. But truth be told, I couldn't tell you if that's a year or 5 years. I would think that for myself, I would probably be replacing them every other year. As long as your flowers are very dry, it should be okay.
Barbara was asking if you found a preferred way to maintain the color of flowers.
Not drying them in the sun, because the sun will fade them. If they can dry quickly, more quickly rather than slowly, they'll keep more of their color. Now, there is a product that you can buy that once the flower is dry, you can spray it on and it's supposed to preserve it. But I think that takes away the whole point of this being organic and fresh and from your own garden.
What other flowers are better dried?
Which one? I've had a lot of success with lavender, of course, daffodils, dried very nicely. Some dry nicely but completely lose their shape. For example, lilies and this is the big one, the hibiscus. You don't get a beautiful hibiscus flower like this. It just kind of flattens in on itself. A lot of the smaller flowers I've had a lot of luck with. I've even tried flowers that are on a stalk like mullein and lamb's ear. You take the stalk and then you just cut it into pieces so that each piece has a few flowers around it. You have to just experiment and see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, some flowers that I really like have been the gomphrena, the straw flower. Status is also very good, and the different types of celosia. And those four have been some of my personal favorites to dry.
Yeah.
I made a wreath this year, this fall, with those flowers, and it actually turned out really nice.
Hi, Pat. Just wanted to add that I've used those gel packs, silica packs, and typically 6 months to a year. I've had good luck with them, depending on how well the container is sealed. And then you probably would want to replace it at that point. It depends on how often it's exposed to open air, because it's going to, the more it's exposed, the more moisture it's going to absorb. And like you said, you already dried everything out. You're just trying to prevent any additional moisture from coming in and invading anything that you've already dried.
Thank you. I hope this inspires somebody to go out in their yard and say, let me try
Marilyn's asking, do you keep the hyacinth whole or break it apart to dry?
Aha. Now, since this was my first time with the hyacinths, I actually broke off the flowers because I didn't know what was going to happen. And so I laid it out as individual flowers. And one of the things I want to do next year is I want to dry the entire stalk and see what happens. Now, of course, it'll be harder to get it dry if it's the entire stalk, because now it's more of a large flower and you have the stem that has to dry, but I'm going to try it that way next year.
So another question, Pat, how much essential oil do you use in your sachets?
There are two sizes of sachet. There's one that's quite small. It's about 2 inches by 3 inches, and then there's some larger bags. We mostly use the smaller ones, and we were putting in, I would say, about 3 drops. You have to be careful because some of them, when you go to tip the dropper, too much will come out. The larger sachets, we actually filled them, say, halfway, and then we put 2 or 3 drops, and then we added the other half on top, and then we added a couple of more drops. I've seen it done where you could put the flowers in a bowl and then sprinkle on the essential oil and then scoop it and put it into the sachet. But we found that if you got too much essential oil on that it could get a little messy. And then you get it all over as opposed to just in the bag. And an advantage of that is also that you then have your essential oil, and if you're only using a couple of drops at a time, if you feel that it needs to be refreshed, say you're 2, 3, 4 months and it doesn't have as nice an odor anymore, then you just go ahead and add another couple of drops. I have one of the small sachets hanging from my rearview mirror in my car. And it's a much nicer air freshener for a vehicle than those chemically scented ones that people buy. I put them in my drawers, had them in the closet. I had them where we store the sheets, so when you take your sheets out, they have a nice fresh flower scent.
I would just like to thank again Pat Donahue for giving a great presentation today. I also want to thank once again our sponsors, Middlesex County, and join us each Thursday night where we have a different topic, and we'll be providing information to you that's updated information on gardening from the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station, as I mentioned early on. And Rutgers Cooperative Extension is basically part of the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station. So many of those wonderful new varieties that you're going to see over the next couple of years developed and being distributed, like the new dogwoods, the hazelnuts, the new strawberry varieties that are coming out this year with our team. We've got new basil, tomato, pepper varieties, and blueberries. And as always, our turfgrass program at Rutgers New Jersey Ag Experiment Station is a very big and robust program. So there's a lot that goes on at the experiment station that really is designed to keep up with the changes that are occurring in our environment. One of the reasons that we do constant research and breeding is because we're seeing a lot of changes in our environment. So we have to develop both food plants and ornamentals that are adapted to these changing conditions that we have. Thank you very much for joining us, and make sure, like Dave said, to tell all your friends, and we hope to see you right back here next Thursday night for Are You Ready to Garden?